You're too old now, Elaine. Nobody's going to fight you for alimony at 54. Sign the papers, and let's make this easy. My husband said it standing in our kitchen, sliding the divorce petition across the counter like a business proposal, laughing softly at his own joke, while I read the settlement terms he'd already had his attorney draft. He'd undervalued his consulting firm by nearly 60% and hidden a second investment account he assumed I'd never find. I signed nothing that day. I just asked for time to review it with my own attorney. But here's what Grant Whitcomb didn't know. Sliding those papers across the counter, reviewing hidden marital assets wasn't just something I understood, it was my actual profession. This is silent revenge, where the quietest person in the room is usually the one who already knows how this ends. Drop a comment and subscribe. I'm Elaine Whitcomb. I'm 54 years old, and for the past 19 years, I've worked as a certified divorce financial analyst and forensic accountant, spending my career doing exactly one specialized thing: finding the assets people hide from their spouses during a divorce. I've testified in over 200 cases, trained a dozen younger analysts now working across the region, and co-authored the training manual most CDFAs in this state still use to identify concealed business valuations and offshore transfers. I want to explain what this work actually involves, day to day, because it's considerably less glamorous than television ever makes it look. Most cases don't involve dramatic offshore accounts or elaborate shell corporations. Most involve small, patient patterns of deception. A business owner who quietly starts paying himself a below-market salary the year before filing, redirecting the difference into deferred compensation his spouse never sees on a joint return. A spouse who begins loaning money to a sibling or a friend, money that mysteriously reappears the month after the divorce finalizes. Inventory valuations that shrink suspiciously in the exact tax year a filing gets prepared. I've spent 19 years learning to read those patterns, the way a physician learns to read an X-ray, seeing structure and intention in what looks, to an untrained eye, like ordinary financial noise. I built that career after watching my own mother get quietly cheated out of her fair share in a 1990s divorce, where nobody thought to question her husband's suspiciously modest accounting, and I'd spent 19 years making sure that never happened to anyone else on my watch. I want to tell you about my mother, Doris, because her divorce is the reason I exist professionally at all. She'd been married to my father for 26 years when he left her for a woman 12 years younger, filing paperwork that claimed his hardware store chain was worth barely a third of what my mother and I both knew it to actually be worth. She didn't have a Susan Mitchell or a Priya Anand in her corner. She had a general practice attorney who handled wills and closings far more often than contested divorces, a kind man who simply didn't know to ask the right questions about inventory valuation or vendor rebate structures. My mother settled for what she was told was fair, moved into a small apartment on a fixed income, and spent the last 15 years of her life doing arithmetic in her head at the grocery store to make sure she didn't go over budget on groceries, while my father's hardware chain, the one he'd claimed was barely profitable, expanded to 9 locations within a decade. I was 26 years old when that divorce finalized. Newly graduated with an accounting degree, I'd chosen almost at random, and I remember sitting with my mother at her kitchen table the week the settlement closed, watching her quietly recalculate, for the third time, whether she could afford to keep her landline phone. I decided, at that exact table, that I would spend my career making sure other women never sat at a table doing that same quiet arithmetic, simply because nobody in the room had thought to ask the right financial questions on their behalf. I went back to school for my CDFA certification within the year, and I've never once regretted the decision, even on the hardest cases, because I think of my mother every single time I open a new file. Grant and I had been married for 22 years. He ran a mid-sized management consulting firm he'd built from a 2-person operation into a company with 16 employees and a client roster that included several regional manufacturers, and for most of our marriage, I'd handled our personal finances while he handled the business's books through his own accountant, arrangement that had always felt, to me, like a reasonable division of labor rather than anything suspicious. I want to describe the early years of that marriage honestly, because they matter to understanding how thoroughly Grant's later behavior contradicted the man I'd actually married. We met at a continuing education conference in Cincinnati, both of us in our early 30s. Grant 3 years into the consulting firm he'd started, after being laid off from a larger company, still working out of a converted spare bedroom, with a single employee, and a client list you could count on 2 hands. He was funny and self-deprecating in those years, quick to credit anyone who helped him, generous with praise in a way that made people want to work harder for him. I remember him telling me, on maybe our fourth date, that he'd never build anything worthwhile without a partner who understood money better than he did, because his own instincts ran toward vision and relationships, rather than the actual numbers underneath a growing business. For the first decade of our marriage, that partnership functioned almost exactly the way he'd promised it would. I reviewed his contracts before he signed them. I caught, more than once, pricing structures that would have left him underwater on a project within months. When the firm nearly lost its largest client during our 8th year of marriage over a billing dispute, I was the one who sat up 3 consecutive nights rebuilding the invoicing history to prove the client had actually underpaid, not overpaid, saving a relationship worth nearly a third of the firm's revenue that year. Grant used to introduce me at industry events in those years as the reason any of this actually works, and I believed him, and for a long time, he seemed to believe it too. Something shifted gradually over the back half of our marriage, in ways I understand more clearly now than I did while they were happening. As the firm grew past 10 employees, Grant hired his own controller, a competent but incurious man named Foster Danby, who deferred to Grant on every judgment call, rather than pushing back the way I always had. Grant stopped bringing contracts home for me to review, telling me, gently at first and then more dismissively over time, that the business had outgrown needing a second set of eyes. I let that shift happen without much resistance, telling myself it reflected the firm's legitimate growth rather than anything more deliberate. And it wasn't until years later, reconstructing the timeline during my own forensic analysis, that I understood the controller Grant hired had been selected, at least in part, for exactly the pliability that made later concealment easier. What I didn't fully understand until 18 months before that kitchen conversation was that Grant had begun an affair with a junior associate at his firm, and that somewhere in the process of planning his exit from our marriage, he'd also begun quietly restructuring the firm's valuation and shifting assets into a secondary investment account under a family trust his brother technically controlled, all in preparation for a divorce he'd apparently been planning for the better part of a year before he ever mentioned it to me. I found out about the affair almost by accident, the same way I imagine most spouses do. Not through any dramatic discovery, but through a small inconsistency that my own professional training simply couldn't let go unexamined once I noticed it. Grant had mentioned, in passing, a conference in Charlotte he'd attended for a long weekend, and I happened to see, months later, a credit card statement showing a hotel charge in Charlotte for 2 rooms rather than 1, on a night the conference program, which I found archived online out of idle curiosity, listed no evening events requiring an overnight stay. I want to be honest that I sat with that discrepancy for nearly 3 weeks before saying anything to Grant, not out of fear, but because 19 years of forensic work had taught me never to confront a pattern before you fully understand its shape. I quietly pulled 6 months of credit card statements, cross-referenced them against his calendar, and found a rhythm of trips and dinners that told a clear, unmistakable story well before I ever asked him a single direct question. I confronted him on a Sunday evening, calmly, laying out what I'd found the same way I'd lay out findings for any client, and Grant, to his credit, didn't bother denying it once he saw the specificity of what I'd already assembled. He told me her name was Camille, that she was 34, an associate he'd hired 2 years earlier, and that he'd fallen in love with her in a way he hadn't expected and didn't fully understand himself. I remember asking him, plainly, how long he'd been planning to leave, and he admitted, after a long pause, that he'd been quietly meeting with Foster Dresden for nearly a year already, long before that Sunday conversation, structuring the eventual divorce in ways I hadn't yet detected. I didn't leave that night. I want to be honest about that, because it matters to the rest of this story. I told Grant I needed time to think, and privately, I began doing exactly what my training had taught me to do, with any set of suspicious financial patterns, documenting everything, quietly, methodically, long before I ever confronted him about the business itself, because I understood, even in that raw, wounded moment, that whatever came next would go better for me if I approached it as a professional rather than purely as a devastated wife. I want to be honest about how the too old comment actually landed, because it wasn't really about age at all, not underneath it. It was Grant's attempt to signal, plainly, that he believed I had no real options left, too old to easily remarry, too unfamiliar with our actual finances to challenge his numbers, too tired, at this stage of life, to fight a drawn-out legal battle over money he assumed I didn't understand well enough to trace. He'd built his entire exit strategy on the assumption that his wife of 22 years was a woman he'd need to manage rather than a professional he'd need to actually reckon with. Our two children took the news in very different ways, and I want to describe both because they shaped how I approached everything that followed. Our daughter Priya, not to be confused with my attorney, whose name was also Priya, a coincidence that struck both of us as darkly funny more than once during the case, was 29 and had always been closer to me than to Grant, and she reacted with an anger that surprised even her. He's been planning this for a year, and he let us all sit at Sunday dinners like everything was normal, she said, the week after I told her, pacing my kitchen in the same spot Grant had once slid those divorce papers across the counter. I want to help. Tell me what to do. Our son, Marcus, 26, took it harder in a quieter way, closer to Grant in temperament, and, I think, more frightened by what his father's choices implied about the kind of man he himself might become. He didn't call for almost 2 weeks after I told him, and when he finally did, his first question wasn't about me at all. Do you think I'll do something like this someday? Is this something that runs in families? I told him honestly, that character isn't inherited the way eye color is, that his father's choices were his father's choices, made freely, and that the son I knew had never once shown me the kind of casual cruelty his father delivered in that kitchen. I don't know if he fully believed me that day, but he came to every single hearing after that conversation, sitting quietly in the gallery, and I understood that showing up was his way of proving the question wrong to himself as much as to me. I called my own divorce attorney, a sharp litigator named Priya Anand. I'd worked alongside professionally for over a decade. The same afternoon, Grant slid those papers across the counter, and I told her plainly what I suspected about the firm's valuation and the timeline of his sudden interest in restructuring assets. Priya and I had known each other since early in both our careers, cross-referring clients back and forth for years, and I trusted her not just for her legal skill, but because she'd watched, secondhand, the way I'd handled dozens of other clients' concealment cases over the years, and understood exactly how I thought about a financial trail before I ever had to explain my own reasoning to her. You're going to want to do this the way you always tell your own clients to do it, she told me, that first afternoon, methodically. No emotion in the paperwork, even if there's plenty of emotion underneath it. Can you actually do that for your own case, or do you need me to build a wall between you and the numbers? I told her I could do it myself, and she believed me, though she checked in more than once over those 4 months to make sure the wall was holding. It mostly was. There were nights, I'll admit, sitting at my own kitchen table tracing wire transfers into an account with my own married name still attached to half the paperwork, when the professional distance I'd built for 200 other clients felt genuinely difficult to maintain for myself. Priya never once treated those harder nights as a weakness, only as an ordinary, expected cost of doing this specific kind of work on your own life instead of someone else's. She agreed immediately that I should conduct my own forensic analysis of the marital estate, not through some outside consultant, but through my own established professional methodology, the exact process I'd used in 200 other cases, applied now to my own marriage for the first time in 19 years. I want to describe the morning of that hearing, because I think it matters to understanding how I actually walked into that courtroom. I woke before dawn, the way I always do before a major hearing, whether it's my own case or someone else's. I made coffee, reviewed my exhibits one final time at my kitchen table, the same table where Grant had once slid those papers across at me, and I dressed carefully in a navy suit I'd worn to a dozen depositions over the years, nothing designed to impress anyone, simply the uniform I wear when I need to think clearly. I looked in the mirror before I left, the same 54-year-old face Grant had decided was too old for anything real, and I felt, standing there, not defiance exactly, but a quiet, settled certainty that whatever happened that day, I had already done the actual work correctly, months before anyone in that courtroom ever raised their voice. I spent the following 4 months doing exactly the work I do for other clients every day, tracing wire transfers, cross-referencing the firm's client contracts against the revenue Grant's attorney had reported to our joint tax filings, identifying the pattern of a business valuation that had been deliberately, carefully undersold in the divorce petition. I found the secondary trust account within 6 weeks, structured through Grant's brother as trustee, but funded entirely from consulting firm distributions that had never appeared on our joint returns. I found, within 3 months, documentation showing the firm's actual revenue was roughly 60% higher than the number Grant's petition claimed, a discrepancy large enough to materially change the entire settlement calculation. Grant's attorney, a confident litigator named Foster Dresden, had retained his own forensic accountant to support the firm's undervaluation, a younger analyst named Trent Kowalski, who, I discovered with a small, quiet irony I hadn't expected, had actually trained under the exact methodology manual I'd co-authored 6 years earlier. During a continuing education course I'd taught myself, though he clearly hadn't connected the name on that manual to the woman on the other side of his client's divorce. I want to tell you more about Trent, because his role in this story ended up mattering more than a simple background detail. I'd taught that continuing education course at a regional CDFA conference in Cleveland, a 2-day intensive on tracing concealed business valuations, and I remembered Trent specifically because he'd stayed after the first day's session to ask unusually sharp follow-up questions about a case study involving deliberately undervalued vendor contracts, the exact category of concealment, as it happened, that Grant had used against me years later. He'd been young then, maybe 26, earnest in a way that reminded me of myself at that age, and I remembered telling him, at the end of that conversation, that he had real instincts for this work and should consider specializing in business valuation disputes specifically. He'd thanked me, a little starstruck, and told me my manual had been the reason he'd pursued the certification at all. I hadn't thought about that conversation in years, until I saw his name listed as Grant's retained expert on the case filings Priya's office received during discovery, and I remember feeling a strange, quiet vertigo reading it, understanding that the young analyst I'd once encouraged toward exactly this specialization had ended up, through nothing more than the ordinary mechanics of professional referral networks, retained against me by my own husband. The hearing where it all came together happened 4 months after that kitchen conversation, in front of a family court judge, reviewing both sides' financial disclosures before a scheduled mediation. I want to describe watching Grant's face when my attorney submitted my forensic report, cross-referencing his firm's actual contract revenue against the undervalued figures his own petition claimed, backed by documentation of the secondary trust account his brother had quietly controlled for the past year. Foster Dresden called his own expert, Trent, to challenge my findings, and I watched Trent open his binder, glance at the methodology citations in my report, and go visibly still, recognizing, in real time, the exact analytical framework he'd studied under my own published manual, years earlier, now being used against the very client whose numbers he'd been retained to defend. "Your Honor," Trent said, carefully, after a long pause, "I need to disclose something relevant to my testimony. The forensic methodology in Ms. Whitcomb's report is drawn directly from training materials I studied during my SACH-DF certification. I recognize the framework because Ms. Whitcomb is one of its original co-authors. I can't in good conscience dispute an analysis built on a methodology I know to be sound because I was trained on it myself." Grant, sitting beside Foster Dresden, went pale in the specific way people go pale when they understand, in real time, that the numbers they'd built their entire exit strategy around had just been traced, methodically, by the one person in the building most qualified to trace them. Judge Marilyn Osei Whitfield, a careful, exacting jurist, who I later learned had presided over complex business valuation disputes for nearly 2 decades, reviewed my report alongside Trent's disclosure for several long minutes without speaking, the courtroom silent enough that I could hear the court reporter's keys and little else. When she finally looked up, she addressed Foster Dresden directly. "Mr. Dresden, does your client wish to challenge the substance of Ms. Whitcomb's forensic analysis, or only its source?" Foster hesitated, glancing at Grant, then at Trent, who was still standing at the witness stand with the particular discomfort of a man who'd just publicly conceded the case he'd been retained to win. "Your Honor, we would ask for a continuance to review the report with independent counsel. You've had 4 months of discovery to review Ms. Whitcomb's methodology," Judge Osei Whitfield said, not unkindly, but with the flat precision of someone who had seen this exact maneuver attempted many times before. "I'm inclined to proceed with today's hearing on the financial disclosures as scheduled, and I'll allow written objections to specific figures within 2 weeks. But I won't delay this matter simply because opposing counsel's own retained expert has confirmed the analysis is sound." She turned to Grant directly. "Mr. Whitcomb, your petition values Whitcomb Consulting Group at just under $2.1 million. Ms. Whitcomb's analysis, supported by your own expert's implicit confirmation of methodology, suggests an actual value closer to $3.4 million, along with an undisclosed trust account holding approximately $410,000 in consulting distributions. Do you have testimony to offer explaining this discrepancy?" Grant stood slowly, and I want to describe the particular quality of his silence in that moment, because it told me more than any words could have. He'd built his entire divorce strategy on the assumption that I would never look closely enough to find what he'd hidden. And standing there, under direct question from a judge who clearly already understood the answer, he had no framework ready for a version of events where I'd actually done the looking myself. Your Honor, I'd like to confer with counsel before responding, he said finally, and Judge O.C. Whitfield nodded, granting a brief recess, though the outcome of that hearing, by the time it resumed 40 minutes later, had already been effectively decided by the silence that preceded it. You're too old to fight this, Grant had told me, 4 months earlier, sliding those papers across our kitchen counter. Sitting in that courtroom, watching his own hired expert concede the accuracy of my findings, I understood that what he'd actually meant, underneath the comment about age, was that he'd never once considered that the woman he'd been married to for 22 years had a professional expertise more relevant to that exact courtroom than his own attorney's entire legal team. I want to mention Foster Dresden's own trajectory afterward, too, because it surprised me. I learned, through mutual professional contacts, that the State Bar's disciplinary committee had opened an informal inquiry into whether Foster had known about the trust account concealment before filing Grant's original petition, given his long working relationship with Grant's brother, the trust's nominal trustee. I don't know the full outcome of that inquiry, and it's not my place to speculate publicly about another attorney's ethics. But I understand Foster's referral volume from other business clients declined noticeably over the following year, the kind of quiet professional consequence that follows a lawyer whose diligence gets publicly questioned in open court, even without any formal finding against him. The settlement that followed reflected the firm's actual value, not the number Grant's petition had claimed, and included the previously hidden trust account as a marital asset subject to division. I didn't take the case out of any desire for public vindication. I did it because 19 years of protecting other people's fair share had taught me exactly what my own fair share looked like, and because Grant's assumption that my age made me easy to outmaneuver had fundamentally misjudged the actual math of who he was dealing with. The settlement negotiations that followed the hearing stretched across nearly 6 additional weeks. Priya and Foster Dresden's replacement counsel, Foster himself, withdrew from the case citing the disciplinary inquiry, replaced by a considerably more cautious attorney named Whitfield Adeyemi, working through the specific division of the firm's now accurately valued equity, the trust account, and the investment properties Grant had also quietly begun shifting in the months before filing. I want to be honest that the final settlement wasn't a clean, total victory in the way a satisfying story sometimes implies. Grant kept the firm itself, since dismantling a business with 16 employees' livelihoods attached to it served nobody's interest, mine included. But I received an equity buyout reflecting the firm's true value, my full share of the previously concealed trust, and a modification to spousal support that accounted for the years of income Grant had structured specifically to appear smaller than it was. Priya called it, at the time, one of the cleaner resolutions she'd seen in a case with this much initial concealment, precisely because the documentation had been so thorough from the start that there was very little room left for protracted argument once the numbers were finally on the table. Most of these cases drag on because nobody can agree on what the facts even are, she told me, over coffee after the settlement finalized. Yours didn't drag because you'd already established the facts months before anyone else in the room caught up to them. I want to tell you about Camille, too, because her part in this story surprised me more than almost anything else that happened. She'd sat in the gallery for the final hearing, the same way our children had, and I learned afterward, through a mutual acquaintance in the industry, that she'd asked Grant directly, the week after the hearing, whether the $2.1 million valuation in his original petition had been accurate. He'd apparently told her some version of a partial truth, minimizing the extent of the concealment, and Camille, who worked in finance herself, and understood exactly what a 60% valuation gap actually meant, had recognized immediately that she was hearing a softened story rather than an honest one. She reached out to me directly, about 6 weeks after the settlement finalized, an email that surprised me enough that I sat with it for 2 days before responding. She told me she wasn't asking for anything, wasn't looking for absolution, but that she wanted me to know she hadn't understood, when she began seeing Grant, the extent of what he was doing financially, and that watching the actual case unfold had changed how she understood the entire relationship, not just its ethics but its foundation. I think I fell for a version of him that doesn't actually exist, she wrote. The man who hid $400,000 from his wife of 22 years isn't someone I actually know, even though I thought I did. I wrote back, briefly, telling her I appreciated her honesty and genuinely hoped she'd find better judgment applied to whatever came next in her own life. We haven't spoken since, and I don't expect we will, but I've thought about that exchange more than I expected to, understanding that Grant's capacity for careful concealment hadn't been reserved only for me. Grant called me once, several weeks after the settlement finalized, and asked, quietly, why I'd never mentioned during our marriage exactly how good I was at this specific kind of work. You knew what I did for a living for 19 years, Grant, I told him. You just never once needed to understand it, until it was pointed at your own numbers instead of someone else's. I want to tell you what happened with Trent afterward, too, because it became one of the more meaningful threads of this whole experience. He called me himself, about a month after the case closed, nervous in a way that reminded me again of the earnest young analyst who'd stayed after my Cleveland seminar all those years ago. He apologized for not recognizing my name on the case sooner, and I told him honestly there was nothing to apologize for. He'd behaved with more integrity in that courtroom than most retained experts manage under pressure from an opposing verdict. And I told him so plainly. You could have found some technical objection to hide behind, I said. You didn't. You told the truth even though it cost your client's case. That's rarer than you probably realize. He asked hesitantly whether I'd be willing to have coffee sometime to talk through some of the finer points of concealed valuation methodology, purely professionally, and I agreed, and that conversation turned into a mentoring relationship that's continued in the 2 years since. Trent left Foster Dresden's regular referral network within the year, telling me he'd found it increasingly difficult to take assignments from attorneys whose clients he suspected were concealing assets, and he now works primarily on the plaintiff side of these cases, representing exactly the kind of spouse Grant had once assumed I'd be too old and too naive to become. I like to think some small part of that shift traces back to a Cleveland conference room years earlier, and an earnest young man who asked good questions about vendor contracts. I've taken on 3 new mentees of my own in the 2 years since the divorce finalized, younger analysts entering the sci-def field, and I make a point, in every single mentoring relationship, of telling them my mother's story before I tell them anything about methodology. I want them to understand, before they ever open a case file, exactly what's at stake when nobody in the room thinks to ask the right financial question on someone's behalf. Our children's relationship with Grant took different shapes in the years afterward, and I want to describe both, because I think it matters to anyone going through something similar with their own family. Priya kept her distance from her father for nearly a year after the settlement, still angry about the year of planning he'd concealed from all of us, and I never once encouraged that distance or discouraged it, telling her only that her relationship with her father was hers to define on her own timeline, not an extension of my own case against him. She slowly rebuilt something with him since, cautious and considerably less warm than it once was, built now on a foundation of much clearer boundaries than either of them had before. Marcus, interestingly, moved toward his father rather than away, in the months after the hearing, telling me once that watching his father's public reckoning in that courtroom had actually made Grant easier for him to understand, not harder. That seeing the concealment exposed and consequences applied gave Marcus a framework for his father's failure that felt more bearable than the private, unresolved suspicion he'd have otherwise carried indefinitely. At least now I know exactly what he did and exactly what it cost him, he told me. I don't have to wonder anymore. I understood what he meant, even if it wasn't the resolution I'd have chosen for myself, and I've made peace with my children processing their father's choices, in whatever order and shape actually helps them. My own life since the divorce has settled into something I genuinely didn't expect to enjoy as much as I do. I sold the house 18 months ago, not out of any financial necessity, but because I wanted a fresh start, unencumbered by 22 years of furniture, arranged around someone else's preferences, and I bought a smaller condo downtown, closer to my office, with exactly the kind of open, uncluttered kitchen I'd always wanted, and Grant had always found impractical. I've taken up rowing on the river most mornings before work, something I'd mentioned wanting to try for over a decade and never once made time for during the marriage, and I've found, at 56 now, a version of my own daily rhythm that belongs entirely to me for the first time since my 20s. I want to tell you about one particular case I took on about 8 months after my own divorce finalized, because it closed a circle I hadn't expected to close so soon. A woman named Dolores Hensley came to my office, 61 years old, facing a divorce eerily similar to my mother's. A husband who'd built a regional pharmacy chain over 3 decades and filed a petition claiming the business was worth barely a fraction of what Dolores suspected, represented by an attorney who clearly assumed a 61-year-old former homemaker wouldn't know how to challenge the numbers. I took that case for a significantly reduced fee, the way I've taken several cases since my own divorce, and I found, within 10 weeks, an undisclosed real estate holding company that had been quietly acquiring pharmacy locations under a separate LLC structure specifically to keep them off the marital estate's books. I sat across from Dolores the day her settlement finalized, watching her absorb, in real time, the difference between what she'd been offered and what she actually received. And I thought about my mother, sitting at that same kind of table decades earlier, with no one in her corner who knew to ask the right questions. Dolores held my hand across the table that day and told me I'd given her back 30 years of her own life's worth, and I told her, honestly, that she'd done the hard part herself, simply by walking through the door and asking someone to actually look. I think about that kitchen conversation often, the exact confidence in Grant's voice when he told me I was too old to fight for anything real. What strikes me most, looking back, is that I never once needed to raise my voice to prove him wrong. 19 years of careful, methodical expertise did that for me, in a courtroom, through a witness who recognized my own work staring back at him from the other side of the table. I've thought a great deal, in the 2 years since, about what Grant actually meant by too old, because I don't think it was really about my age at all, not in the literal sense. I think it was about a specific kind of fear men of Grant's generation sometimes carry, the fear that a woman who has spent decades building quiet competence, decades accumulating expertise nobody bothered to fully register, might one day turn that competence toward the very person who dismissed it. I think Grant looked at me across that kitchen counter and saw not a 54-year-old woman past some imagined prime, but a threat he'd never once taken seriously enough to actually assess. And the too old comment was less a statement about my worth and more a hope, spoken out loud, that I'd simply accept his version of my own diminishment without ever checking the math myself. My mother never got to see any of this play out, having passed 6 years before Grant filed his petition, but I think about her often during this whole process, wondering what she'd have made of watching her daughter do, methodically and professionally, exactly what she'd never had the resources or the representation to do for herself. I keep a small photograph of her on my office desk now, taken the year before her own divorce finalized, and I glance at it every time I open a new case file, a reminder of exactly why this work matters beyond any single settlement. I turned 56 last month, and I hosted a small dinner for it, my children, Trent and his wife, a few of my mentees, Dolores Hensley among the guests, actually, because we've become genuine friends since her case closed. Someone raised a toast that evening, and I found myself thinking, listening to it, about how completely wrong Grant's assessment of my worth at 54 had turned out to be. Not because I'd proven him wrong out of spite, but because the 2 years since had simply, quietly, continued accumulating evidence he'd never bothered to look for in the first place. I've thought, too, about what Grant might have said to me if he'd understood, that afternoon in the kitchen, exactly who he was dismissing. Priya once joked, near the end of the case, that Grant had made the single most expensive miscalculation of his professional life by assuming his wife's expertise stopped at the edge of our own household finances. I think there's something true in that, though I'd frame it more simply. Grant spent 22 years benefiting from exactly the kind of careful, patient financial vigilance he later tried to dismiss as irrelevant the moment it stopped serving his interests and started protecting mine instead. I don't know if Grant has ever fully reckoned with that irony. Marcus tells me, occasionally, that his father brings up the case sometimes, always framed as bad luck rather than bad judgment, still reaching, even now, for a version of the story where the outcome was simply unfortunate circumstance rather than the direct, foreseeable consequence of choices he made deliberately over the better part of a year. I've stopped needing him to see it any differently. His version of the story is his to carry. Mine is considerably lighter than it used to be. I don't know exactly what Grant's life looks like now beyond what the children share. I know, secondhand, that his relationship with Camille didn't survive the year following the settlement, and I know his firm's revenue has continued growing under new controller oversight the court required as part of the settlement's compliance terms. Oversight, I understand he's resented but complied with. I don't spend much time thinking about him beyond what's necessary for our children's sake, And I've found that the absence of that thinking is its own quiet kind of freedom, a mental space I didn't fully realize I'd been giving away for 22 years until I finally got it back. What I want anyone listening to this to understand, more than any specific detail of the case itself, is that the number of years you've lived was never actually the liability Grant tried to convince me it was. 19 years of accumulated expertise, decades of patient, careful competence, a lifetime of learning to read the exact patterns that conceal dishonesty. None of that diminishes with age. If anything, it's the only kind of asset that only ever compounds. If you've ever had someone assume your age, or your familiarity, made you easy to outmaneuver, I hope you remember this. Expertise built quietly over decades doesn't disappear just because someone underestimates it. It waits, patiently, for the exact room where it will finally matter most. Thank you for spending this time with me. If someone has ever assumed you were too old, too tired, or too far past your prime to fight for what's actually yours, tell me about it in the comments. Subscribe to Silent Revenge for more stories about the quiet people who finally get to be seen exactly as they are. I'll see you in the next one.